A year after my husband died, the house had finally grown quiet in a way that didn't hurt every minute. The first months had been unbearable. Every room carried echoes of him. The way he cleared his throat before speaking. The sound of his footsteps moving toward the kitchen in the early morning. Even the garden seemed to wait for him. But time does something strange to grief. It doesn't erase it. It simply teaches you how to carry it without dropping everything else. By the time spring arrived again, I had begun to feel almost steady. That was when I decided to tell my son about the inheritance. My husband had arranged it years earlier, quietly and carefully. He never liked discussing money openly. But near the end of his illness he explained the details to me. There was an account, larger than I had expected, placed inside a trust under my name. It was meant first to secure my future. Later, when the time felt right, it could pass to our son and his family. He had asked me to keep it private for a while. People behave differently when they know too much too soon, he told me once. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. But a year had passed. Our son Daniel and his wife, Laura, had been supportive through the funeral and the difficult months afterward. They visited regularly. Laura often brought groceries. Daniel handled repairs around the house without being asked. I thought the worst part of the story was behind us. That evening I invited them for dinner. The house felt warmer with their voices in it again. Laura talked about work, Daniel told me about a new project at his company, and for a while we spoke about ordinary things the way families used to before grief changes the rhythm. After dinner I went into the kitchen to prepare tea. As the kettle warmed, I thought about how to tell them. Not as an announcement, but gently. Something that would reassure them that the future was secure. I carried the tray down the hallway toward the living room. The door was nearly closed. Just before I pushed it open, I heard Laura's voice. At first I caught only a few words. Eventually the house will be ours anyway. I stopped without meaning to. Daniel answered quietly. Not right away. Of course not, she said. But you should think long term. The tray felt heavier in my hands. She's alone here, Laura continued. This place is too big for one person. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Then he said something that made the hallway feel suddenly colder. Well, eventually we'll need to talk to her about downsizing. Laura laughed softly. Exactly. A smaller place would be easier for her, and it would free up the property. I stood there listening to my own heartbeat. It wasn't cruelty in their voices. That might have been easier to understand. Instead it sounded practical, like people discussing furniture they plan to move later. She probably still has some savings from Dad, Laura said. But I doubt it's much. Daniel lowered his voice. I don't think she understands how expensive things will get, Laura replied without hesitation. That's why we should start planning now. The kettle whistled faintly behind me in the kitchen. Neither of them noticed. I stepped back slowly down the hallway. The tray never reached the living room. I set it on the kitchen counter and turned off the stove. For several minutes I just stood there, staring at the steam rising from the kettle. My husband's voice came back to me then. People behave differently when they know too much too soon, Gox. When I returned to the living room a few minutes later, they looked up normally. Laura smiled. Everything okay? Yes, I said. I handed them their tea. No one mentioned the conversation behind the door, and neither did I. Over the next few days, something inside me shifted quietly. I wasn't angry. Anger requires surprise. Instead I felt something calmer and heavier, a kind of clarity I hadn't expected to arrive so suddenly. The following week I called Martin, the attorney who had helped my husband structure the trust. We met in his office on a quiet afternoon. He listened carefully while I asked him to review the documents again. There's something I'd like to confirm, I said. He adjusted his glasses and opened the file. The trust remains entirely under your control, he explained. Nothing transfers automatically, so if I decide not to distribute anything yet, That's entirely your choice. And the house. That remains solely yours. I nodded slowly. For the first time since my husband died, I felt the quiet strength of the arrangements he had made. Not because he distrusted our son, but because he understood something about human nature. Weeks passed. Daniel and Laura continued visiting on Sundays. Nothing outwardly changed. Laura still brought groceries. Daniel still fixed the loose step near the porch. One afternoon Daniel mentioned the future casually while we sat in the living room. "You know," he said, "this place is a lot for one person to maintain." I looked at him calmly. "I manage." He nodded, though the thought clearly remained. "We could always help you find something smaller later," he said. Laura watched me carefully from the couch. I smiled gently. "I appreciate the concern." Neither of them mentioned the house again that day. Later that evening, after they left, I sat alone in the same chair my husband used to occupy. The letter he had written about the inheritance rested in my lap. His handwriting was steady and familiar. "This is not just money," he had written. "It's time." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now I did. Time to observe. Time to listen. Time to decide carefully who should inherit not just what we owned, but what we trusted. Outside, the evening light faded slowly across the garden. And for the first time since that night in the hallway, I felt no urgency at all.